Good afternoon. My name is Kajotan Iyeka, and I serve as Editor-in-Chief of African Studies Review. On behalf of my colleagues at the journal, I am pleased to welcome you to the 2024 edition of the ASR Distinguished Lecture. Each year, we welcome a distinguished colleague to present a paper representing the state of the field and its significant debate. This year's speaker, Chika Okeke-Agulu, the Robert Kimmel Professor of Art and Archaeology and African American Studies at Princeton, is a remarkable choice for his field leadership and work at the forefront of African art and art history. Professor Salah Hassan will introduce Professor Okeke-Agulu, but before then, permit me to present the ASR Awards for 2024. Before I do that, I want to thank my colleague, the Deputy Editor of the Journal, Kate Luongo, and members of the prize committee for their terrific work reading and selecting this year's winners. Please join me in thanking them. That said, I am pleased to begin with the ASR Prize for the Best Africa-Focused Anthology or edited collection. The winner for that this year are Oyerunke Oyewumi and Ewan Gima for the book Naming Africans on the Epistemic Value of Names. Professor Oyewumi, please.
A picture or two? Yes, this is so important.
At the back, yeah. At the back. The photographer is at the back, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. For the Best Africa-Focused Anthology, we have the honorable mention that goes to the book Through Commissions and State Building by Bonnie Bauer, Jasper Ayala-Zuno, and Sylvia Bauer. I think Professor Ibawo and Bauer are here. Congratulations. Okay, so I think the photographer is over there, so let's
Thank you so much.
Next in line is the Doctoral Dissertation Award, which goes to the best dissertation written at an African institution. The winner this year is Omomayowa Olawale Abati, who wrote this project at Stellenbosch University titled Beyond Not Too Young to Run, Party Candidacy, Political Representation, and Legislative Effectiveness of Young Politicians in Nigeria's Fourth Republic. Unfortunately, due to visa issue, Omo Mayowa is unable to join us, but please let us congratulate him in absentia. The honorable mention goes to Alicia Ndlovu from WITS. The title of the dissertation is Sustaining the Unsustainable, Political Accountability and Development in Sub-Saharan Africa's Resource Economies. Let's congratulate Alicia, who is also unable to join us today. The last but not the least, the prize for the best article published in the ASR in 2023. The winner this year is Humphrey Asamoah Agekum, and the title of the paper published in December 2023 issue of the journal is We Are Not Into Politics, but Politics is Into Us. The politicization of the Ghana Armed Forces through patronage exchanges between political elite and military leaders. As I said, that came out in this December 2023 issue of the journal. Humphrey is also unable to join us, but let us extend our congratulations to him. And the honorable mention for the best article published in the journal in 2023 goes to Emeka Thaddeus Njoko and Isaac Derry for their paper, Gendering Counterterrorism, Kunya, and the Silencing of Male Victims of CRSV in Northeastern Nigeria. That also appeared in the December issue of 2023. I understand that Mbasungom Ukwe will be accepting the award on their behalf. Are you here? No? Okay. Well, let's congratulate them. Yeah. So with that, I come to the end of the ASR Awards this year. So I hope you will submit to the call next year and encourage your students and colleagues, to do the same thing. To introduce Professor Okeke-Agulu is Professor Salah Hassan, who is the Chancellor of Global Studies University and the Dean of the African Institute in Sharjah. He is also Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University and has really been at the forefront of developing not only the field of art history, but African studies globally. Please join me in welcoming Professor Salah Hassan.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. It is with immense pleasure that I stand before you here today to introduce my dear colleague and wonderful colleague, Chika Okeke-Agulu, the Robert Schirmer Professor of Art History and Archaeology and African American Studies at Princeton University, who is featured, as you know it, of course, as the sincere speaker of the African, or lecturer of the African Studies Review distinguished lecture. I'm grateful to the organizers of this prestigious lectureship for inviting me to do the honor. So thank you so much, Kajitan, for inviting me to do such an honor. Like many colleagues in this audience, I have known Chika as a leading scholar in the field of African art history and visual culture, which makes it easy for me to recite his biographical sketch. That is, from his early education in Nigeria and the USA to his impeccable record of his scholarly publication, as well as his cutting-edge curatorial interventions. And of course, his record as a public scholar, in addition to the many prestigious awards his seminal work has garnered. However, to do so would require a parallel lecture to Chika's one, which is you are here to listen to and not to my own impositions. Therefore, in this brief introduction, I would like to highlight Chika's groundbreaking scholarly contributions, not only to the field of African and African diaspora art history and visual culture, but to the larger field of the study of modernism from a global and comparativist perspective. I have known Chika for close to 3 decades when we met first in London at the Whitechapel Gallery, co-curators of the well-known show, 7 Stories About Modern Art in Africa. Fast forward, we became also in the mid-90s as co-editors of the journal, INCA, Journal of Contemporary African Art. These encounters and interactions have given me the opportunity to know Chika more closely, and I can therefore attest with great confidence that Chika is not only a highly accomplished scholar, but is also a very fine human being and a conscientious person. To this, I will refer back to it later. Chika's transformative contribution to the field can be measured in many ways by his intellectual engagement as a published scholar and the remarkable breadth and complexity of his scholarly work that has traversed several areas and subjects. 2, his invited prestigious lectures in numerous venues such as in the USA and abroad, which included him as a speaker at the wide-renowned Oxford Union in 2022 and Cambridge Union in 2021 debates. 3rd, his cutting-edge curatorial interventions and force, and lastly, by his mentorship of many younger scholars at Princeton and many other institutions worldwide. Therefore, I wish to highlight very briefly the following aspect of Chika's exceptional accomplishment. First, as a unique combination of a scholar, an artist, and a curator. You know, often people see Chika as a scholar, but they forget the fact that he actually a great and accomplished artist. Chika works reflect an awareness of the latest discourses, not only in African and African diaspora art, but also in contemporary and modern art worldwide. He's also a public intellectual whose contributions venture beyond the academic domain, as evidenced by his influential blogs, his regular columns and op-eds, publishing some of the most influential and widely read in print and online news magazines, and most recently as a leading scholar activist in the field of reparation and restitution of culture and heritage artifacts, which will be more, of course, highlighted in his lecture today. Second, Chika is among the foremost scholars who have focused on the study of the modernist dimensions of African art, which has largely been neglected for decades within the discourse of mainstream African art history. His approach to African and diaspora art goes beyond the pitfalls of authenticity and other stereotypical representations of African art in viewing African and African diasporic artistic tradition as nuanced, diverse, and dynamic. He is deeply engaged with up-to-date discourses of visual, culture, and cultural studies, and in newly emerging fields which are challenging conventional perception of non-Western art. Third, his writing reflects a complex vision of African art that restore to its domain practices from Northern and Southern Africa, as well as the diaspora, which have been previously excluded within the scholarship that focuses on sub-Saharan African art to the neglect of other parts of the continent. His scholarship espouses a diasporic framework in which African artistic traditions are positioned as a global historical presence rather than a product of a narrowly confined geographic entity. Fourth, on surveying Chika's published work, one is struck by the sheer, of course, quantity of his scholarly output in comparison to many of his peers. However, what impresses me more than the quantity is its consistently distinguished quality and its remarkable influence in the field. One could highlight many, but I will skip that. The most important among them is postcolonial modernism, art, and decolonization in the 21st century, and many of his books on Alanatsui, Obiora Udachiko, among many other contributions. Earlier in this introduction, which is something that I want to refer to, is that Chika, I mentioned, is a conscientious human being. He himself roots this in being a child of the Biafran War. He recently attested to this at a speech he gave at a solidarity rally with Palestinians at Princeton University. Chika said the following, and I quote, "As a child of the Biafran War, I couldn't stay silent watching the senseless killing of innocent children, women, and men unfolding life before our eyes. At a time when many of us are silent or silenced by the corporate university system and the politics of fear, Chika demonstrates what it means to be, or what it means to speak truth to power." So with this, please join me in welcoming Chika Okeke to this podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Salah, for that introduction. And I want to thank the ASR team, especially Kajetan, for inviting me to give this lecture. And it's really an honor to be part of this year's event, but especially to speak about a topic that has been of great interest to me. system to work with me. Yes, I'm trying to get the okay. Last month, I was in Benin City, Nigeria, for the hard hat opening of the yet completed first building on the campus of the Museum of West African Art, MOA for short. The plans for the museum, initially called Edo Museum of West African Art, were announced in 2019 with great fanfare. Its spectacular design, conceived by one of the world's most leading architects, the Ghanaian David Adjaye. Since then, the design of the museum has shifted away from the monumental showpiece building to a dispersed campus of modest, finely proportioned structures that include the Institute, designed by Adjaye, the Rainforest Gallery, and the Art Guest House, designed respectively by Dakar-based Worofila and Studio Contra of Lagos. My enthusiasm for the museum's design principle derives largely from the remarkable way the architects translate essential elements of indigenous Edo architecture, particularly the coursed laterite walls, the high-pitched roofs, and rain harvesting courtyards, into the visual and structural language of the museum's buildings. Beside its exciting design, I'm interested in the museum's origination from one of the most urgent, pertinent, and vexed subjects in recent global cultural diplomacy: academic and scholarly disputation and civil society activism. And here I'm referring to the matter of restitution of African art and cultural heritage and looted by agents of European empires during the colonial era and currently held hostage in major museums and private collections in Europe and the United States. So today I wish to explore MOA's transformation from what was conceived primarily as a museum for repatriated royal Benin artifacts, the so-called Benin bronzes, to what I think of as an aspirational model for a truly post-colonial museum that must replace the continent's lethargic and desolate ethnographic museums, mostly conceived by Europeans and have failed to meaningfully find relevance among their African publics. My extended interest then is in the modalities of decolonizing and reimagining the work of museums in today's Africa to ensure that they reliably participate in the work of archiving the continent's cultural heritages, including where necessary, repatriated artifacts, but also support the production and transaction of knowledge within and across borders of their stakeholder and target communities. But what is this connection between the MOA and the discourse and politics of restitution? How did we get from demands for the return of Africa's looted cultural heritage to the making of what I see and hope to be an inaugural gesture at building a post-colonial museum on the continent? To answer these questions, here's a quick account of relevant moments in restitution history. In 1973, 12 African states sponsored the first UN General Assembly resolution on cultural property titled Restitution of Works of Art to Countries Victims of Expropriation. This came just 3 years after the passage of the much-hyped UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. To the Africans, the convention failed to address the large-scale and systematic cultural violence of colonial dispossession. By bringing the issue of restitution to the General Assembly, they sought to link it to cultural imperialism after the end of normative colonialism. That resolution, however, was largely ignored. In the years since, calls for restitution have grown louder and more spectacular. For instance, Mwazulu Diabanza's theatrical heists in European museums during the COVID years. And the voices have grown more diverse, just as the long-term consequences of the post-colonial condition, specifically the crisis of subjectivity and identity on both sides of the colonial encounter. And these have sharpened tensions between old and new nationalisms in a supposedly global age. I will not rehearse the many debates and arguments made so far by different parties in Africa, Europe, and the United States. Instead, I wish to mention one significant moment that exemplifies what until then was the standard attitude of major museums in the West to restitution demands from Africa and elsewhere. I refer to the now infamous Declaration on the Importance and Value of Universal Museums, made in 2002 by directors of 18 big-shot museums in Europe and the United States. Although the British Museum was not among the signatories, it was no less deeply involved, as it has been suggested that the declaration was in fact made by peer institutions to fend off calls by the Greek government for the return of the Parthenon marbles held by the London Museum. That declaration by a generation of museum directors one might call the empire's last children is remarkable for its total commitment to the alluring modernist idea of universalism guaranteed by Western post-imperial socio-economic and geopolitical world order. By warning against the dangers of nation-based claims to cultural heritage, the signatories presented the very institutions built in the age of empire as inviolable keepers of culture, supposedly for the peoples of all nations. More than 2 decades have passed since, yet the unbridled arrogance of this assertion, amplified in the following years by James Kuno and others, who further argued against attempts on the part of restitutionists to, according to him, quote, deny the truths of our basic and inevitable cultural interrelatedness, unquote. Left unremarked by these universalists and general overseers of the world's cultural heritage is, first, the fact that the interrelatedness Kuno speaks of was forged by the sword of empire. Second, that for all their universalist claims, several of these museums, including the British Museum, were immunized against restitution calls with the so-called inalienability laws, some put in place in the era of decolonization, their holdings listed as untransferable national patrimony. In other words, these museums are guarded by the power of the post-imperial nation rather than by multilateral institutions like the UNESCO. Third, that to many in the global south who, not having the right passports, as we just heard, can never visit these museums. The present situation looks more like hoarding rather than sharing of the world's heritage. And fourth, they did not appear interested in the radical possibility of reimagining the locations of the universal in a truly global post-imperial world. There is no doubt that the 2002 declaration and the later positions of some of its advocates represented the last stand of anxious scions of empire to safeguard their precious museological world order from the post-colonial hordes seeking structural readjustment of global cultural heritage. It is against this background that the establishment of the Benin Dialogue Group, BDG for short, in 2010 marked, in one specific context, a fresh and impactful approach to the previously dismissed yet persistent question of colonial looting and post-colonial restitution. First convened by the Museum of Ethnology, Vienna, the group was formed by several European museums, representatives of the Benin Royal Court, and of the Nigerian government to explore short and long-term solutions to the thousands of looted Benin royal artifacts scattered in European museums. With the British Museum and the Berlin State Museums, both of which hold by far the highest number of Benin bronzes and other artifacts represented in the BDG, there is no question that restitution, or something that feels like it, had moved from the marginal space of the quickly forgotten 1973 UN resolution to the center stage of international cultural diplomacy. Fully cognizant of the unjust and violent act of expropriation of Benin royal art in their collections, the BDG has focused on possibilities of exchange and loans of the artifacts to Nigerian partners, while deferring the prickly matter of repatriation, which they initially had on their agenda, to some future time. At their 2013 meeting in Benin, hosted by the government of Edo State in collaboration with the Royal Court and Nigerian Museum officials, the group inaugurated the Benin Action Plan for documenting Benin collections of the BDG museums. At Cambridge in 2017, the Oba of Benin announced plans to establish a new royal museum in Benin City that would host circulating museums, including looted artifacts loaned by European museums. In 2018 at Leiden, a steering committee was mandated to begin work on the museum project through a new entity called the Legacy Restoration Trust. And in 2020, the Museum am Rotenbaum in Hamburg secured funding for the Benin Digital Project that has since cataloged more than 5,000 objects data from 137 institutions across 20 countries. For all its boldness and fresh perspective on what had become a monumental impasse in restitution politics and discourse, deferral of the ownership and restitution question has important consequences. I have on several occasions expressed deep concern about this, as have many others, including the indefatigable Ghanaian scholar Kwame Opoku. Yet, I am sympathetic to the position of the BDG signatories who see their initiative as the most promising yet in what had been hardened positions of European keepers of Benin loots and their Nigerian claimants. Although the German government has returned ownership of more than 1,000 objects on their own, my stand still remains this. So long as loan agreements between the BDG lending institutions and their Nigerian partners do not legally exclude the rights of the Nigerian stakeholders to pursue restitution claims, the current arrangement could indeed be a significant step toward a crucial objective of restitution advocates, that is, proximal access to the continent's finest and most important cultural heritage presently trapped in Europe and the United States. But why, of all the many astonishing instances of colonial expropriation of African artifacts and cultural heritage, did the European museums focus their energies on Benin royal art? And how is the BDG initiative not a cunning contraction of a continental problem into a single containable thematic? Is Benin the exception or model? The short answer to the last question is that it is both. For there is no question that the looting of Benin City was not just the most substantial and spectacular, it is also arguably the best documented case of systematic colonial looting of African artifacts. Moreover, it is also one of the clearest cases in modern history of restitution in which the identity and status of the claimants of original ownership are unimpeachable. While the story of the so-called Benin bronzes is well known, let's recall how they ended up in major museums in Europe and America. In November 1896, James Phillips, the representative of the British Crown in the coveted Niger Coast Protectorate, which encompassed the Benin Kingdom, sought to break the Oba's trade monopoly in the region to advance the economic imperative of empire. To win support of the reluctant Foreign Office in London, Phillips argued that he had, I quote, reason to hope that sufficient ivory would be found in the king's house to pay the expenses incurred in removing the king from his stool, unquote. In January 1897, Phillips organized an ill-advised, fatal, supposedly trade expedition to Benin City. And in February, a punitive expedition of 1,200 Royal Marines invaded Benin, burned down the palace and much of the city, and in fulfillment of Phillips' plan, systematically looted thousands of high-value artifacts kept in the palace, including centuries-old ivory and brass objects that constituted the kingdom's treasures and archive. Oba Ovonramwen was exiled, ending the sovereignty of the 700-year-old dynasty. Some of the key actors in the invasion amassed their own personal loots that they sold off in Lagos right away. And back in London, the official loots were auctioned off by the Home Office. The British Museum would inherit nearly 1,000, while the Berlin Ethnological Museum, thanks to what Griselda Volga has called the cunning diplomacy of the Austrian Felix von Luschen, received objects in numbers almost comparable to the British Museum. Numerous objects soon crossed the Atlantic, acquired by scores of US museums, including the Met, Chicago Field Museum, the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, and others. Remarkably, a majority of the 5,000 plus objects so far documented by Digital Benin Project originated from that 1897 looting by the British Navy. So let me put it this way. Of all the countless African artifacts in Western museum collections, Benin royal bronzes are not among those that can be said to have uncertain provenance. Nor is the identity of the original owner and successors a matter of dispute. I mention these 2 points simply to suggest that the usual arguments keepers of looted African artifacts, even when they acknowledge that they might have been illegally or unethically expropriated from their original locations, blame lack of provenance records for their inability to consider their restitution. But with the clarity we have about the history and context of their looting in 1897, and the fact that the successors of Oba Ovoramwen, including his great-grandson, the reigning Oba Ewuare II, and the government of Nigeria have been demanding their return since at least 1960, when the country gains its independence from Britain, it is impossible for anyone to seriously claim ignorance about their status as looted objects, or that their rightful owners have not asked for their restitution, which some politicians actually say with a straight face these days. So indeed, the case of the Benin bronzes compares only with a few other high-profile loots in the kingdoms of Ethiopia, Ashanti, and Dahomey, specifically tied to the well-known moments in the execution of what Dan Hicks terms corporate militaristic colonialism, before but mostly after the 1884-85 Berlin Congo Conference, during which European powers, with the consent of the United States, divided up Africa for systematic colonial exploitation. What I'm suggesting is that the Benin objects present the clearest and most compelling case of restitution and must be pursued with this as a singularity, as have the Benin Dialogue Group. Yet, the idea of a sustained, meaningful, productive, and good faith dialogue by keepers and legitimate claimants of looted artifacts should be a model of what is possible if we must confront the inevitable and necessary task of decolonizing the so-called universal or global museums, whose claim to significance lies on the extent to which they benefited and continue to profit from imperial and colonial cultural extraction. This new type of engagement must also be based on what Benedict Savoy and Felwine Sarr have called a new relational ethics. That is, the mutual rethinking of how expropriated objects can be restituted, yet allowed to circulate along with artifacts from other nations and cultures as part of global cultural exchange and knowledge production. And these, I propose, are the conditions for the making of MOA as a post-colonial museum. I earlier noted that in 2018, the BDG set up a steering committee that, along with the Nigeria-based Legacy Restoration Trust, was charged with establishing a museum in Benin for repatriated artifacts. In the context of restitution politics, this move clearly was meant to assuage anxieties of European critics of repatriation, who often pointed to the lack of museums in Nigeria decent and fitted enough to host the priceless loots. While I have often argued that the Europeans have no right to have this as a condition for the return of African loots, it is the decision of the trust to move the matter of restitution to the periphery of its mandate that made it a new museum paradigm that I'm calling the Postcolonial Museum. I do not have the luxury of time to detail the significance of this shift, but let me note that besides the name change from Edo Museum of West African Art to Museum of West African Art to de-emphasize restitution of Benin bronzes, to creation of multiple spaces within the campus, captures a wide array of interests for a broad segment of Edo, national, and West African populations. For instance, the Institute will host a collection, an exhibition facility, an archive and research center, and archaeological and conservation laboratories to train new generations of West African experts. The Artisan Hall provides a retail space for local metal artists and craft workers. The Rainforest Gallery, surrounded by a replanted forest of indigenous flora, will be a premium space for modern and contemporary art, while the campus grounds will be open to the public for events and ceremonies that are part of the city's social and cultural life. In other words, the museum's redefined mission is dictated by the necessity of emplacing it in the life of its local community, while it supports high-quality preservation and archiving facilities, as well as research and knowledge production relevant to the West African region. The museum, thus, is not simply a home for repatriated African artifacts. More importantly, it is and must be an alternative to the many of Africa's national ethnographic museums, which, as they exist today, are largely colonial-era institutions tweaked around their edges to serve post-independence governments and their suspect national unity agendas. Despite holding priceless artifacts, as the one in Lagos, these ethnographic museums were alienated from broad spectrums of the citizenry, as you can see in the figures, including even the political regimes that used them as tools for their mostly unsuccessful and suspect national integration projects. And what I'm calling the Postcolonial Museum in Africa cannot be achieved by simply changing the management, collecting and educational programs of the Colonial Museum. So if the Colonial Ethnographic Museum in Africa is at once the troubled offspring of imperial ideology, the poor instrument of post-independence governmentality, and an institution alienated from both the elite and commoners of its imagined community, the Postcolonial Museum must be located at some critical distance from it. Precisely because the Colonial Museum was from inception corrupted and scarred by the epistemic violence of colonial enterprise, but also unable to establish its relevance in the shifting post-independence civic and cultural imagination and experience, the Postcolonial Museum must be conceived both as a radical break from this past and as a new space for rethinking, repairing, and reanimating histories of African societies, and for weaving the rich tapestry of life in the present through art, artifact, and expressive cultures, old and new. The Postcolonial Museum, as the MOA project suggests, ought then to be a place for conservation of exemplary arts, a site of memory, and as important, it should be a platform for negotiation and transaction of sociocultural life through the support of active production of new arts and for re-evaluation of the meanings of heritage and tradition in an always changing present. In this new museum, the disciplinary and discursive lines between and across history, archaeology, art, design, and craft ought to be orchestrated with the singular objective of creating a polyvalent space where art objects become a part of production and experience of social life by the individual and the imagined community. Against the terrors of the single story, the Postcolonial Museum must provide the ground for re-examining narratives, including the canonical and the marginal, the certain and the precarious. An innate history and heritage cannot become occupied territories. Rather, they must constitute the theater where memory and experience, in all their complex manifestations and expressions, through the agencies of symbolic objects, are invested with new meaning. Given the state of national museums in Africa today, with their colonial genealogies and, in the case of private museums, their elitist and neoliberal basis, what I'm describing as the post-colonial museum can seem to be another way of naming the impossible museum. You might even charge that this museum is nothing but the figment of my inspired fantasy, or the utopian projections of a disgruntled critic that has been overfed by post-colonial theory. Well, but I must note that there have been recent and significant museum projects that nevertheless ought not to be confused or conflated with the post-colonial museum. One example of this is the Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar, which occupies a tenuous space between the post-colonial and neo-colonial, reflecting yet turning aside from Leopold Sedar Senghor's dual allegiance to imperial universalism and post-colonial sovereignty. Senghor's earlier museum project, the Musée Dynamique, an initial move to somehow Africanize the Imperial Colonial Museum, opened in 1966 as the venue of the Black Art Exhibition, which was the centerpiece of its epochal Festival of Negro Arts. Presented by Senghor as a platform for reclamation of African artistic and cultural autonomy after colonialism, for his European partners who conceived and designed the museum, it represented an opportunity to extend Western museological models and paradigms in independent Africa. That is, a cultural extension of France-Afrique. Thus, much as it was physically located in Dakar and discursively in the epicenter of negritude and Black affirmative ideology, the museum's focus in its heyday on celebratory exhibitions of European modernists and the African sculptures that inspired them came at the expense of knowledge production about African art and artists, old and new. And it is in this context that the new Museum of Black Civilization can come across as a reckoning with the neo-colonialist ideas at the basis of the earlier Musée Dynamique. Despite that it focuses on Blackness as its organizing principle, thus reminding us of Senghor's racial essentialist project that never quite found relevance in much of continental Africa, the new museum presents an opportunity to constitute a space for rethinking African archival heritage and arts. Moreover, its curatorial mandate, described as, quote, political, cultural, artistic, and economic response of negritude against the technological and cultural devaluation of Black civilizations, unquote, is indicative of a commitment to confronting histories and legacies of colonialism even as it projects African subjectivities that transcend regional, linguistic, religious boundaries upon which colonial governmentality depended. It remains to be seen, though, the extent to which the museum, with its negritude DNA, participates in building and fostering a civic and transnational imagination at once attentive to the richness of African artistic heritage and cultural archive, the diversity and depth of its histories and politics before and after the colonial encounter, as well as the meanings and possibilities of art in the production of narratives past and present of Senegalese and African peoples. In thinking about models and inspiration for the Postcolonial Museum in Africa, I look instead to institutions developed by Africans before and in response to the colonial encounter. I think here, for instance, of the Yoruba Palace and the Igbo Mbari, and the 1960s Mbari clubs in Ibadan and Osogbo. And here's why. The Yoruba Palace of old served as a public institution that represented secular, religious, aesthetic, economic, and political aspirations of the community and kingdom. Though occupied by the royal in its design and symbolism and function, the palace, usually located at the center of the town and near the marketplace, is at once the royal court, the town hall, the seat of government, and the public square. It was the center of religious life and the site of conflict resolution, secular pageantry, and public performances. It was also the public museum and gallery of the finest works created to participate in the cultural and social life of the community. Moreover, the central location of the palace and its siting adjacent to the marketplace was designed to affirm the vital connection between king and citizen, between the elite and commoner, and within it, first-rate and popular art, the traditional and the new, constituted valuable components of knowledge production and knowledge and social production, artistic and cultural expression, as well as resources for memory and world-making. On the other hand, the Igbo Mbari, which was an architecture, sculpture, painting, and performance complex built in honor of the earth deity, represented the community's ideals and concerns. It was the space of enacting and reflecting on the esoteric and the mundane, moral tales and vulgar jokes, the spiritual and secular narratives, the comic and the taboo, through art, dance, and performance. In the Mbari, the highly valued art of master artists met that of the imaginative dilettante, old and young. And once publicly exhibited, however, the Mbari structure was abandoned, or rather presented to natural forces to recycle it back to the earth, the sphere of the earth goddess, thus clearing the ground for a new Mbari in some future time. In other words, the value of Mbari lay not in the resulting artifact, but in the process of its making, exhibition, and performance. That is, Mbari was a rejection of the archival value of the art object and fetishization of its material worth. Indeed, the establishment of the Mbari clubs in Ibadan and Osogbo in 1961 and 62 by the German linguist and critic Ulibaya in collaboration with several Nigerian and African writers and artists was an inspired attempt at creating a post-colonial artistic laboratory based on the functional and conceptual principles of the Igbo Mbari and, I would argue, the Yoruba Palace. While not quite a museum in the normative sense, Mbari, Ibadan, and Osogbo had some of the elements I am proposing as constitutive of the Postcolonial Museum, including the meeting of diverse arts, elite and popular artists and audience, the production, exhibition, and acquisition of traditional and experimental contemporary art, and like the Yoruba Palace, it was sited adjacent to a popular market. The key elements of the Yoruba Palace Igbo Mbari and modern Mbari clubs that I have sketched out here, including the idea of collective ownership and access, the meeting of elite and popular arts, archival and anti-archival impulses, and the production and celebration of artistic quality and symbolic value, all of this I am proposing might serve as locally derived models and constitutive elements of the Postcolonial Museum in Africa. So let me conclude by suggesting that Museum of West African Art, thankfully, might not be the dedicated home of repatriated Benin bronzes as originally intended by the BDG, yet it presents a unique and more thrilling opportunity to realize what I consider the model for a truly post-colonial museum. For its Edo-inspired design, its incorporation of excavated ancient palace and location across the existing one, its hosting of repatriated artifacts and objects from the National Ethnographic Museum, and its investment in the social and cultural contexts of its target opportunities situate MOA within a politics of history and memory in which the colonial encounter and its aftermath are only one among many stories of Benin, Nigeria, and West Africa. All of this is to say that the new museum I envision is a space of public-facing social intercourse, of knowledge production and archiving, of exhibition and performance of high and popular art. In other words, a space for reckoning with the past, present, and futures of the museum's multiple stakeholders, rather than a mausoleum of heritage. So when David Adjei speaks with reference to the MOA of a new museum paradigm for Africa, I am convinced that he was announcing his and my vision of the post-colonial museum in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Okeke-Agulu, for that wonderful lecture that we will think about for such a long time. The paper will be published in the future issue of ASR, so I hope we will have the opportunity to engage it. As we don't take questions, this brings us to the end of the 2024 ASR Distinguished Lecture. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference.